The stamp hovered over my paperwork like a loaded gavel while the clerk smirked behind his glass fortress, chin tilted, voice dripping with that slow, practiced cruelty that treats a feed like a leash. Around us the city hall buzzed, fluorescent hum, stale lemon cleaner, a guard lounging with a hand on his radio, while my grandson stood small at my elbow, cheeks still raw from the schoolyard's lesson, holding up a phone that proved the exemption in letters bright as noon and yet somehow invisible to the man who liked the sound of pay first. I saw the room the way a surgeon sees a chest open, the clock's one-eyed stare, the lines shifting like a tired animal, the clerk's ring tapping the counter in bored dominance, Malik's breath hitching as he swallowed that old bitter air meant for men like me, and I knew, as surely as paper cuts and calloused palms, that before this afternoon is done, that stamp will land where the law says it should, and their neat little game will crack under the weight of its own rules. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protects our elders. Next, he said, and the word hit me like a door closing in my face. I stepped to the counter holding my blue folder against my chest, the plastic warm from the press of my palm. The saguan smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner. A vent rattled somewhere above us. The clock over the ticket screen ticked too slow like it belonged to a different afternoon. I set the folder down and opened it so the first page caught the fluorescent light. The city's policy printed clean, the section marker underlined with the same careful hand I used to sign permission slips when my daughter was little. The clerk didn't look at it. He looked at the fee sheet taped to his terminal, then at me, like he had already seen this scene 100 times and knew the ending. 125, he said. Card or cash? Behind me, the line breathed a tired breath. Shoes scraped. Paper whispered against paper. Somewhere to the right, a baby set off a soft cry and the mother patted its back in a rhythm that matched the tick of the wall clock. My grandson Malik stood close to my side, phone in his hand. The glow of the screen turned his face the color of a small moon. I thought of the way he had walked home from school at noon, shoulders rounded, a word caught behind his teeth. He had smelled of gym floor and chalk and the kind of fear that makes a boy look older for a few hours. We're registering a study project, I said, my voice steady, in the way I learned to be steady when the world waits for you to stumble. For the school and the community. There's an exemption. The clerk's name tag flashed when he leaned forward. He tapped a laminated chart with a bitten fingernail, and its corner made a nervous click on the counter. 125, he repeated. Everything has a fee unless marked otherwise. He slid a stack of forms toward me, the top one smudged from other hands. I set the stack aside and turned my blue folder to face him like a mechanic opening a hood. Policy on top, letter from the principal beneath it, the volunteer schedule underneath it, dates neatly blocked with a pen line that didn't waver. I had paperclipped the plan and put a sticky note on the section that mattered, the one that said educational projects of community interest could be processed without charge. A simple sentence. It didn't raise its voice, it simply stood there. Malik angled his phone and scanned the tiny QR at the bottom of my printout, the one that led to the city's website. His thumb danced, quick and precise. The screen mirrored the paragraph. He nodded once, shy but firm, like he wanted to hand me courage without making a shoe of it. The clerk exhaled through his nose. He pushed the forms back at me with a gesture that said I thought I was wasting everyone's time. He said, "Fill out page 2 again. You wrote the date wrong."
I looked at the date. It wasn't wrong. I had written it the way they asked. Month, day, year, each box occupied by one neat number. The ink hadn't bled. The lines were clean. Page 2, he said, as if reading the weather to someone who couldn't see the sky. A security guard shifted on his stool a few paces away and pretended he wasn't watching. His radio crackled once and then went quiet. He smelled faintly of stale coffee and wool. Every time a voice rose anywhere in the room, his head turned the way a sunflower turns to light. The turning told me my place. A man like me knew the choreography of rooms like this. Step forward, show papers, step back when told, keep your voice low, keep your breath lower. "I have the section here," I said, keeping my voice where it belonged. I pressed my finger to the line I had underlined. My hand is not a young man's hand. The skin is mapped with pale lines from years of work. In those lines lived the things I had learned from my wife about not confusing calm with surrender. It says the fee is waived for projects like this. He reached for a stamp and held it near my application the way a teacher holds a pen near a test they haven't graded. Red ink had dried in a thin halo around the rubber letters. The stamp sat in his hand with a lazy weight, ready to be the final word if he wanted it to be. "It says a lot of things," he answered, "but I need a payment or a different code. Without a payment, it doesn't move. Step aside if you're not paying so I can keep the line moving." The insult wasn't in the words. It was in the choreography. He tilted the stamp toward my form like it already belonged there. He pointed at the tape sign, "No exceptions without authorization." The sign had a coffee ring on one corner. It had been up so long the tape had gone yellow. Rules that live too long in one spot go brittle. They crack where you can't see. Malik's shoe bumped my heel. It wasn't an accident. It was a quiet nudge. He lifted the phone so I could see the screen. The paragraph crisp and current. The city seal plain as daylight. His finger hovered over the line that matched my underlined printout. "I need you to look at this," I said, and I slid my printout a little closer to the edge of the counter. I did not push. I did not plead. I made room for the truth to travel the last inches on its own legs. He didn't look. Two people behind me shuffled in place, their warmth pressing between my shoulder blades and the door that led to the hallway. A man coughed into his sleeve. The baby's cry died into a soft hiccup. The clock ticked its hoarse tick, and the panel pinged with another number that no one seemed eager to claim. Fluorescent light hummed overhead, blue as a cheap lake. "Sir," the clerk said, and there was no sir in his sir. "I can't authorize anything. You can pay, you can leave, or you can wait for a supervisor, but I can't stop the line to read your paperwork." "Then call a supervisor," I said, and even as I said it, I felt the old pressure gather behind my eyes, the same pressure that came the day I walked into a different office to ask for a simple correction on a record and came out with a list of steps that bent like a maze. "Please." He tapped his keyboard with two fingers, not looking at the keys. The screen reflected a rectangular light in his glasses. He lifted the phone at his elbow, pressed a button, and spoke without moving his mouth much, like he didn't want to waste the shape of the words. The guard shifted again, the whirl of his uniform sighing. I smelled toner from a machine I couldn't see. Someone at the far counter tore a form from a pad with a sound like fabric ripping. I rested my palm on the blue folder to steady it. I rested my other hand on the counter, close enough to the red stamp to see the tiny burr on one corner of its plastic handle. The folder felt like a small boat in lively water. Inside it, the pages made their soft, private music. I thought of the lesson Malik's class wanted to offer the city. 2 histories held at once, each given a shelf of its own, neither used as a weapon. I had written those words in the project description. I had felt my wife's steadying presence when I wrote them, the way she used to stand behind me while I filled out forms, her fingers on my shoulder like a promise the world would try to test. A woman 3 bodies back leaned forward and squinted.
"Didn't they waive that last year for the library kids?" she said to no one in particular, and then looked down again, remembering the rules about speaking in rooms where rules were the air you breathed. The clerk's eyes flicked up and then back to his screen. He flicked the stamp in a small spin like a coin he wasn't willing to spend. "Supervisor is on his way," he announced, as if those words required a fee too. "In the meantime, page 2. I slid the top sheet aside and revealed the letter from the principal. The signature still dark from last night's pen. The city seal on her letterhead was the same as the one on my printout, same as the one on Malik's glowing phone, same as the one etched in brass on the plaque by the door. I aligned the edges and made a neat stack, then placed the volunteer schedule on top so that the months and dates could breathe. Malik shifted closer, and I felt the brush of his sleeve against mine. My wife would have liked that, how he stayed near, not hiding behind me, and not stepping in front, just close enough that I could feel his breath slow down. He turned his phone so the QR showed again, as if to say, the paper is right, and the screen agrees, and we are not guessing. The guard cleared his throat and adjusted his belt. His radio whispered numbers that meant nothing to me. He didn't need to say a word. The stance was enough. This room knew how to make you smaller without ever raising its voice. The supervisor did not arrive all at once. He appeared in the glass panel's reflection first, a shape moving with the deliberate pace of someone used to being summoned and never surprised by what he finds. When he stepped into real view, he carried a thick binder tucked under one arm, its tabs color-coded and dog-eared the way a book looks when it has actually been read. He wore his badge clipped to his pocket rather than his chest, as if to say he kept his authority close, but not his armor. "Sir," the clerk said, and this time there was a little "sir" in it because the word had a place to go. He gestured to my folder with the hand that held the stamp, as if the stamp itself might want a point. The supervisor set the binder down. He didn't open it yet. He rested his fingers on the cover and let his gaze move from my face to the blue folder, to the letterhead, to Malik's phone. He took in the layout the way a chess player takes in a board that has nothing but pawns and one queen out early. The clock ticked behind him. The air conditioner coughed a tired shiver that lifted the corner of a flyer about recycling. I kept my feet where they were. I kept my breath measured. I had the section number clear in my mouth if asked. I had the schedule like a road I could recite with my eyes closed. The blue folder waited between us like a small, honest witness. The supervisor lifted the cover of his binder and slid a finger down a laminated index until it found the word exemptions. He flipped to it with a motion that made the tabs whisper. He set the binder square on the counter, right next to my printout. Two versions of the same promise breathing side by side. The clerk shifted the stamp from one hand to the other, impatient to make the paper submit. And then his hand lowered toward my form. His hand kept falling, the red stamp lowering like a slow hammer, and I felt the room lean toward it the way people lean toward a train pulling into a station. "Wait," the supervisor said, not loud but shaped like a stop sign, and the clerk's wrist paused a breath above my form. Air moved again. Somewhere a printer woke up and clattered its teeth. A dry fern in the corner shivered under the vent and then settled. The supervisor opened his binder, and the tabs whispered again. His finger traveled the page like a careful driver finding a lane in the rain. He didn't look at me first. He looked at the evidence the way a medic looks at a wound, assessing edges, color, depth. I slid my printout so it sat square beside his binder. Two versions of the same truth, breathing the same fluorescent air. He tapped a line with his knuckle. "What code did you use?" he asked a clerk, who named a number that sounded like a lock. "That code defaults to fee," the supervisor said, still looking down. "If there's a qualifying exception, it won't catch it." He glanced at my folder. Do you have the project description and the school letter? I opened the folder further, the hinge creaking a little from age. The green of the plastic has a sound if you've carried it long enough. I laid the principal's letter on the cool counter, then the schedule of volunteer hours. Saturday mornings for cleanup around the library steps, Tuesday evenings for oral history interviews, dates lined up like rail ties. The schedule's boxes and lines steadied me the way a plumb line steadies a wall. Malik stood a half step closer and angled his phone. The small screen showed the same paragraph as my printout. He had highlighted the sentence with his thumb. The digital glow bounced off the chrome pen holder and made a small star there. The clerk cleared his throat like a man with a pebble he refuses to spit out. He reached for the stack of forms again and slid a fresh one toward me. You still need to rewrite page 2. The date format is wrong. Month, day, year, not day, month, year. It is month, day, year, I answered, keeping my voice low enough to stay inside the rules of the room. Look! He looked like a person who has learned to see only what keeps the line moving. The guard shifted on his stool again, knee creaking. In the glass pane, I caught my own reflection for a second. Older man, shoulders squared against a counter that never loved anyone back. Behind me, the woman who had spoken before kept her eyes on her notebook. She didn't have to. She had already done enough by letting the truth slip from her mind to her mouth. The supervisor turned a page in his binder, and I heard the click of the 3 rings tapping together. We're not rewriting until I see what we're working with, he said, not unkindly, just flat as a level. He pointed to the bottom of my printout. This QR matches the current site? I said it did, and Malik lifted his phone as confirmation. The blue-white of the city seal reflected in the supervisor's badge clip.
Fine, he said. He nudged the binder into alignment with the edge of the counter, a small ritual of control. We'll need the exact language and the current revision date. Pull up the internal policy index, he told the clerk. The clerk tapped at his keyboard with 2 fingers, sloppy at first, then more precise when the supervisor's shadow fell across his hands. The terminal coughed up a list of codes in a gray frame that made the world look sicker than it was. He searched, clicked, scrolled. I watched the way the system stacked options: fee first, exception under a fold, a road hidden under a road. I knew that feeling. I had lived my life finding the hidden turn that wasn't illegal, just unadvertised. Here, the supervisor said, and he set his binders so that the heading exemptions sat next to the gray screen, same word, spelled without a heart. He traced the paragraph with a fingertip. Educational projects of community interest, he read. Processing fee waived upon documentation. He drummed the pad of his finger once, then twice. Do you have documentation of the community service component? I slid the schedule higher, so the months caught the light and the boxes looked less like ink and more like a promise. Yes, I said, and the letter. He read the first sentence of the letter silently. The paper made no sound. My wife used to say, paper keeps its breath for moments like this. The clerk interrupted, impatient. Even if that's true, he wrote the date wrong. The supervisor looked. He looked the way a carpenter checks a cut against a square. The date is correct, he said, and the words landed soft but heavy, like wet cloth on a table. He lifted his eyes to the clerk's. Stop saying the date is wrong. The guard looked away to hide a smile that never fully formed. The fern took another dry breath. The air smelled of warmed plastic and the sour note of toner, like the building had sweated out a long morning. I felt the humiliation loosen its grip by a finger. Not gone, just less. The clerk's mouth thinned, and then he did the thing people do when they don't want to admit they are wrong. He moved the goalposts. "We still need the addendum," he said. "There's always an addendum." He fumbled under the counter and produced a single-page sheet with tiny print crowded into 4 cramped blocks. He pushed it toward me like a plate of food I hadn't ordered. The top corner had a crease like a wrinkle on a frown. No one had mentioned an addendum before. My folder did not have this page. My preparation did not include this bend in the river. I took a slow breath and tasted the lemon cleaner again. I read the blocks without moving my lips. The addendum asked for descriptions we had already provided in the project plan, only smaller now, squeezed into lines as narrow as a grudging mind. It asked for the signature of the faculty sponsor, which we already had in the principal's letter, but would need again on this paper that refused to believe the existence of any other paper. Malik tapped my wrist twice, a quiet code. I can help. He opened the Notes app and began copying key phrases from the printout with 2 thumbs that moved like birds. He toggled between the curriculum outline and the service schedule. The glow of the screen lit the ridges of his knuckles. He was giving me speed I did not have, and I gave him steadiness he had not built yet. That is how bridges hold. "Fill this," the clerk said, tapping the addendum with the butt end of the stamp. Ink dust rose like a soft cloud and settled on the edge of the page. "And you'll need the rubric codes here and here." He circled 2 boxes with a pen that left a bird trail. Rubric codes. I could feel the line behind me stirring, the way a herd goes alert when one animal stops to drink at the wrong time. I recognized the tactic. Make the form speak a language the petitioner doesn't understand, then blame the petitioner for not understanding.
The supervisor didn't stop him. He let the clerk finish his small theater, then cleared the space with a wipe of his hand. "I'll get the rubric index," he said, and for a moment I liked him, not as a friend, but as a fellow craftsperson doing his work with a conscience. He took a half step back and raised his chin toward the hallway. "We're not doing this at the counter. Too many moving pieces. Bring the file and bring the binder." He picked up the binder. The clerk gathered my forms as if they were loose cards he was afraid would blow away, then hesitated when his eyes fell on the stamp. He left it, but almost didn't. The guard slid off his stool and stood, a quiet hinge oiled by habit. We moved as a small procession through the crowd. The hallway was narrower than a promise. Our shoulders brushed dull paint. The floor changed from tile to something that tried to look like wood and failed. Fluorescent light followed us, drip by drip, fixture by fixture, a shallow river on the ceiling. The smell changed too. Less lemon, more dust, a faint sweetness like paper left in a warm room. We passed a bulletin board. A corner of one flyer had come loose and breathed in and out with the air conditioner's sigh, like it was alive and tired. A child's drawing of a city seal done in crayon hung crooked. The wax colors had bled in heat. Malik slowed for a half heartbeat to look at it. When he walked again, his shoulder touched mine and steadied my pace. I thought, not for the first time, about the walk home from school. About how he had held his jaw and stared at the sidewalk like it had confessed something ugly. About how the day had put a loud word in his path and asked him to step over it without tripping. I had told him then, out loud but quiet, that we would not trade one legend for another. We would not turn history into a weapon or a shield. We would carry it like a shared load, one on each end. At the door marked review, the clerk punched a code and the lock clicked like a polite throat clearing. The room beyond was small and colder. A rectangular table sat under a tired lamp. The terminal on the desk hummed, fan wheezing. A coaster with a coffee ring guarded a circle of clean wood that had forgotten what clean felt like. The supervisor set his binder down in the center, and the binder made a dull thud that sounded like purpose. He gestured to the chair on the near side. "Put your materials here," he said. "I'll pull the rubric and last year's case to compare." I placed my blue folder gently on the table. The surface was a little sticky. A faint grit under my palm spoke of a spill never fully erased. I opened the folder again and breathed in the dry smell of paper warmed by my body. Malik stood to my right, phone ready, eyebrows lifted in a question to which I answered with a nod. He started a new note labeled with today's date and the word process. The clerk slid the addendum toward me and handed me a pen so light it felt disposable in my fingers. The tip scratched in a voice like a match on rough wood. I broke each answer into the small boxes they provided, letting the letters sit square in their cages. I didn't hurry. I didn't let myself linger so long that doubt could breed. The supervisor leaned over the terminal and typed, and his typing sounded different from the clerk's, like the difference between a carpenter's hammer and a person tapping a wall to hear if it's hollow. Fields opened and closed. One screen showed fee as the default, the way a path shows the rut of many feet. Another screen hinted at a submenu under a submenu. He found the rubric index and printed it. The printer coughed and then sighed and spat the page into his hand. I reached for the printed rubric and matched the codes to the boxes the clerk had circled in sloppy ink. The codes sat in the squares the way answers belong in a puzzle when the picture finally makes sense. Malik checked each one against the website and lifted his chin in a tiny nod when they matched. The door behind us clicked once, and someone in the hallway laughed at a joke that didn't travel into our room. The laugh died at the threshold like a moth at a window. I slid the completed addendum into the stack on top of the principal's letter and the schedule. I lined the corners with my thumb, squared the edges with the table. The binder's tabs quivered under the vent's breath. The supervisor reached for the binder again, flipped to the section with a practiced wrist, and set one hand flat on the page that had carried my hope all afternoon. He looked up at me for the first time like a man ready to decide, and the clerk's fingers found the stamp again. The room's cold settled on my skin like a thin film, while the supervisor angled the binder toward the terminal. The clerk hovered with the stamp as if it were a piece of emergency equipment only he was licensed to use. The fan in the CPU whined, rose, and steadied. Dust in the lampshade turned the light the color of weak tea. My blue folder lay open in front of me like a small boat in a gray harbor, its papers breathing when the vent exhaled. "Pull last year's record," the supervisor said, and the clerk rolled the chair closer with a squeak that sounded like a complaint. He typed the code he liked, the one that led to fees first. Gray boxes stacked on the screen in a grid that could have been a city map if the city didn't care whether anyone arrived. The cursor blinked like a tired heartbeat. When the search result popped, he clicked too fast and the system scolded him with a tiny chime. He tried again, slower. A progress bar crawled across a narrow trench of pixels. The supervisor held his hand out, palm up. "Rubric," he said, and I passed the fresh print. He matched our boxes to the rubric list and checked my addendum with the kind of focus that burns away showmanship. His breath fogged the glass of the monitor for a second, then cleared. He made a note in a short stack of scratch paper. The pencil's point hissed. Malik stood at my shoulder, steady as a metronome. He had opened the photo of last year's mural announcement on his phone, the one that showed the library kids smiling under the city seal, the caption naming the same program we were here to register, the bottom corner stamped, "Fee waived." He dimmed the screen a notch to save battery, then brightened it again when the lamp flickered and took some light away from us. He didn't talk. He harnessed his nervous energy and fed it into small, useful motions, pinching to zoom, swiping to the second image that showed the protocol number,
copying that number into a note so we wouldn't have to squint. On the screen, last year's record finally opened like a door on a rusty hinge and showed only a gray rectangle and an error line that read, "File cannot be rendered." The clerk shrugged a thin shrug. "It's corrupted," he said, and the word felt like a verdict that had gotten used to being a sentence. "We can't compare. Without comparison, I can't." The supervisor lifted a finger. "We can," he said, and there was no music in it, just weight. He turned to me. "Do you have a physical copy?" I slid a plastic sleeve from the rear pocket of the blue folder. The paper inside was slightly warped from the humidity of summers past. I had printed it back when last year's kids had needed a hand with chairs for their presentation. Because I don't know how to be in a room like this without a backup you can touch. I set it down on the table's sticky spot, and the edge stuck a little, then freed itself with a soft kiss of paper peeling away from wood. The protocol number matched the one on Malik's phone. The date sat in the corner like a tiny anchor. The supervisor laid his binder beside our copy and braced both with his palms, as if the room might try to blow away the proof. He looked from paper to screen and back. The clerk clicked open a different tab, and the system punished him with a red banner. "Default fee will be assessed if saved in current state." The words were small, but the color wasn't. It was the kind of red that insists. The clerk's hand crept toward the stamp again, attracted to red the way iron is attracted to a magnet.
A thin printer in the corner spat a test sheet no one had asked for. The paper slapped a tray with a flat sound. The smell of hot toner nicked my throat. The guard leaned into the doorway and pretended to examine a bulletin on the opposite wall. His radio whispered numbers that were not about us, but the posture said we were the only thing happening worth watching. "Your code routes to a fee," the supervisor said to the clerk, and tapped the screen once, knuckle thudding like a knuckle on a locked door. "You need to change the routing before you save." "It's the standard path," the clerk answered, small and stubborn. "If I don't save it, the record isn't created." "If you save it now," the supervisor said, and the pencil point ticked on his scratch pad, "the fee posts and we spend a week undoing your mistake." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tension in the room thickened anyway. The fan whined higher. The lampshade hummed. The air conditioner coughed up a cold breath that brushed the hair on my forearm. I looked down at the veins on the back of my hand, blue lines under brown skin, finished threads and strong as rope. My wife used to tap those veins and say they were rivers that had learned to flow around rocks without pretending the rocks weren't there. Malik nudged my elbow, a small signal he had something more. He flipped to a second screenshot, the city website's page for policy revisions, showing the current revision date, showing the section still in place. He had circled the line with a finger-torn loop. He had made it big enough that even the lamp's dying bulb could not obscure it. He swallowed, and I heard it, a clean sound, like a bead dropping into a glass. The clerk typed the protocol number from last year into a search field and mashed enter like force could make a file uncorrupt. The same error line bloomed, then folded into itself. He huffed. He clicked an option to attach external documentation, and the system spat another red warning: "Do not proceed without supervisor authorization." He shot a glance at the badge clip on the supervisor's pocket. The supervisor tugged the binder closer and turned the tab. The plastic edge squealed because the tab had been handled too many times by hands that weren't sure and hands that were. He set the binder open to the section that used the words "Educational Projects of Community Interest" again and weighed it in place with his wrist. He read the paragraph to himself in silence. The room listened without meaning to. He turned to the clerk. "We will enter the exception code," he said. "We will reference the policy by section." He flattened his palm on my printed copy. We will cite the written documentation presented. The clerk's jaw worked. He clicked into a watermark field and the options dropped down like stingy doors. Fee, reduced fee, deferred fee, no fee with conditions. He scrolled. The list stopped. He scrolled again, and only then, only when he dragged it stubbornly past its reluctance, did a hidden option appear. Qualifying exception per section. It had been there the whole time, folded under itself like a trick knee. The supervisor traced that option with his pencil point, once like a blessing, then stopped. The terminal pulsed the new alert in red that sprawled across the top like a bar of emergency lights. Saving in current mode will assess base fee. To avoid assessment, change charge path first. The clerk's hand, trained by habit more than malice, hovered over the mouse, then over the stamp, as if a stamp could solve a software warning by force of tradition. My chest tightened in the old way. I have known rooms that make your lungs small without touching you. I have stood in lines where paper wasn't paper, but a mirror held at the wrong angle. I tasted the metallic tang of worry at the back of my tongue and chased it with a swallow of air that smelled like plug-in lemon and dust. I thought of Malik's shoulders when he came home, how shame had borrowed his posture for an hour. We were here to show him posture can be returned to its owner.
"Granddad," Malik whispered, a breath in my direction more than a sound, and lifted his phone so the revision date shone like a tiny street light. I nodded so he would know I saw it, and so I would remember to be the person he needed me to be, the person my wife trained me to be, with quiet hands on my back. The clerk clicked near the red banner, and a second prompt rose, asking for confirmation in a voice that had never learned to be merciful. Confirm assessment of fee. 2 buttons blinked. Confirm. Cancel. The cursor drifted toward confirm like a moth to a coil. The supervisor said, "Do not touch confirm." He looked into the clerk's face and held him there. "Find the charge path. Change it first." The clerk's fingers, rebellious children, kept twitching near the mouse. He opened a sub-menu under a sub-menu. The window jumped. A field labeled Path to Charge appeared and then hid again behind a modal window asking, "Are you sure you want to navigate away?" Fear makes bad systems worse. He backed out, went forward, backed out again. The chair creaked under him like a board under a too heavy step. Outside the open door, I heard the hallway's fluorescent buzz and the soft shuffle of the line in the saga, a distant body moving in place. The woman with the notebook would be out there, making small notes that mattered to her day and didn't know she was part of mine. The guard leaned against the jamb, watchful but not unkind. He smelled faintly of wintergreen gum now. Time has a scent if you stand still long enough. I placed the printed copy of last year's protocol next to the monitor and lined up the numbers so they made a straight sentence across wood and glass. Malik steadied his phone at an angle that showed the web page and our reflection in miniature. The supervisor adjusted the binder so the policy title crowned the little arrangement of proofs like a header on a page you don't dare delete. The red banner didn't care. It pulsed again, and the confirm button brightened in a way that invited mistakes. The clerk's thumb rubbed the stamp's handle like a worry stone. The stamp's rubber face had picked up a grain of lint that clung to the letter E. I watched the lint as if it were a string I could pull to unravel this knot. The supervisor breathed out through his nose, the sound tired but not defeated. "Look for the path override," he said, patient the way a good teacher is patient with a student who has been poorly taught. "It's there." The clerk clicked the gear icon that someone had tried to hide with a bad color choice. A new panel slid in from the right, and for a second I saw it. A drop-down labeled Path to Charge with 3 choices and a 4th hidden under a scroll. He touched the scroll. The mouse stuttered. The cursor slipped. The red confirm window jumped back in front like a rude guest stepping between hosts.
the stamp lifted in his other hand, as if to make up for the curse's uncertainty. And then the terminal beeped and flashed a warning that said, in letters I could read from across the table, "If you proceed, the fee posts and cannot be reversed." If this is reaching you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send it to a friend who cares. The warning sat on the screen like a flare in fog, and the supervisor didn't flinch. He slid the binder closer, let a palm rest on its weight, and with his other hand, he reached past the clerk's wrist and clicked the gear icon again. The panel opened, slow as a drawer swollen by humidity. He scrolled past the obvious choices the system wanted us to choose. The hidden line appeared, thin and stubborn, as if shy of daylight. Charge path override. He selected it. The red bar dimmed from siren to bruise. He exhaled, and the air in the room loosened by a small measure. I heard the fan breathe easier. He pointed the pencil to the field that asked for justification text and spoke the words like a mason laying mortar. Cite section, attach documentation, reference prior case. The clerk's mouth became a straight line, not happy, not angry, just defeated by accuracy. He clicked into the box and typed what the supervisor dictated. The keys made a hollow sound that matched the smallness of the room.
Malik adjusted the brightness on his phone so the revision date shone clear. He nudged my elbow once to show me, as if I could forget. That glow painted the corner of the binder in a pale square. He had set the phone to low power mode earlier. Now he toggled it off because this moment needed clarity more than it needed a saved battery. I felt newer air in my chest because of that small choice. The supervisor turned the binder a fraction and underlined the policy title with the edge of his pencil. He didn't write, he pressed, leaving a shallow impression that caught the light. He asked for the addendum, the schedule, the letter, and the printed copy with the protocol number from last year. I fanned the papers across the table in the order he named them, edges squared, corners flush. My blue folder stayed open like a book you trust, enough to leave face up. The guard at the door leaned back against the frame and shifted the weight off one foot and onto the other. A soft squeak from his boot said the room had grown less dangerous. The clerk reached for the stamp, habit stronger than attention, and the supervisor's hand hovered, not grabbing, just near enough to remind the stamp it was not in charge. The stamp paused like a hand that had finally remembered its own rudeness. The clerk set it down, the rubber face landing in the felt tray with a dull kiss. "Attach the prior case," the supervisor said, and the clerk clicked to upload. The error about the corrupted file blinked its little punishing blink. The supervisor didn't bother with the dead link. He slid last year's printed protocol so it rested just under the monitor and instructed the clerk to enter its number into the notes field and to cite the public posting on the city site. Malik tilted his phone again to the mural announcement photo, ensuring the protocol and date were visible. The clerk copied the number, and I watched his handwriting change shape for a second, the way a person's writing does when they realize it may be read by someone who checks. We worked like that for several minutes, the room now a small workshop where each tool had a reason to exist. The supervisor completed the rubric boxes with the codes we had matched, and he drew a short line from each code to the schedule date it supported. Documentation tied to calendar, purpose tied to time. He slid the addendum toward me again and asked me to initial the margins where the printed lines were too small to hold everything. My initials looked like fossil prints under clear water. He pulled a thin form from the back of his binder, something I had not seen at the counter, a correction slip for procedure. He wrote in a block hand I could read without squinting. Add visible checkbox for community educational exemption on main intake form. Include path override in intake training. Provide link to policy index
on the footer of intake page. The pencil moved with a sure sound, a polite rasp that I felt in my teeth. He signed it, printed his badge number, and dated it. He set the slip aside, not a solution yet, but a seed with a tag. He looked toward the guard. "I'll need a copy of that posted to the intake station later," he said, and the guard nodded as if he were used to carrying slips between offices and into places where staplers live. The guard's radio crackled once and then went quiet again. He didn't step in, he didn't step away. It felt like balance. I breathed slower than I had at any point in the day and realized, with the clarity that comes when fear drops its shoulders, that my humiliation had been scaffolded by habit more than by malice. The building had simply learned to prefer the path that charged, and everyone in it had let that preference pretend to be law. I thought of the way Malik had come home from school, his face holding two histories at once, like a man trying to drink from two cups. I had told him on the sidewalk that memory isn't a trophy and isn't a pardon. It's care you carry. In this room, I could feel that care move like a current.
The supervisor turned from the terminal and rested his knuckles on the table. "We'll move back to the counter," he said, and the way he said it sounded like the turning of a page. He gathered the binder, the correction slip, the rubric, and the stack of documents I had aligned. He did not pick up the stamp. Neither did the clerk. The stamp waited, obedient for once, in its small felt bed. We retraced our steps through the hallway. The vent blew a stronger breath, lifting the loose corner of the fly with the crayon seal. The wax colors looked brighter in this pass, as if the drawing had been cleaned just by being seen twice. Malik's phone dimmed, and he tapped the screen to keep the light on. Our shoulders brushed the dull paint and left no mark. The flaw's fake wood squeaked on a seam, and I made a note in my mind about where the seam lived, the way an old driver notes a pothole that never gets fixed. When we turned the last corner, the saguao met us with its own weather. The lemon cleaner tang, the heat of bodies, the paper's soft rain, the wall clock's beat. People recognized something in our procession. No uniforms beyond the supervisor's badge and the guard's belt, but the binder in front, the purposeful steps, the blue folder at my hip. Eyes lifted and then softened, as if we were returning from a place where decisions are made and not all of them are bad. We took our original spot at the counter. The clerk moved behind the terminal with less theater than before. The supervisor set the binder open to the policy page. The edge of the binder pressed the faint line into the worn laminate. He placed the correction slip to one side where it would not be ignored. He rested the printed schedule on the other side, the grid of dates visible to anyone who wanted to see what children planned to give back to the place they live. He asked me to lay the letter from the principal on the counter, so the letterhead aligned with the city seal etched in the brass plaque by the door. The two seals mirrored one another, one old and cold, the other crisp and warm from my folder. Malik stood where he had before and lit the phone screen again, the revision date shining like a small lighthouse that had finally found the shoreline it was built for. The woman with the notebook looked up and met my eye. She gave a small nod, the size of a human kindness you can carry comfortably in your pocket. Behind her, a man with a cap took a step back to make a clean corridor from the door to our counter. The baby, somewhere to the right, slept now, the sound of breath measuring a quieter rhythm for the room. The supervisor rolled his shoulders once, not dramatic, just loosening the hinge before a hinge is needed. He arranged the papers in a line that read like a sentence: policy, precedent, schedule, letter. He placed the binder's tab near the counter edge so his fingers could find it without looking. The clerk cleared his throat but did not reach for the stamp. I placed my palm on the blue folder and felt its familiar give, the soft resistance of something that has held names and dates and hopes for years without tearing. Malik's sleeve brushed my wrist again, a quiet check-in. The guard took one step to the side to open the angle between door and counter. Air moved. The fluorescent hum lowered a notch, or maybe my pulse did. The clock ticked exactly once, and I knew, without needing to see the second hand, that our work in the small room had put this larger room in a different posture. We were not finished. No promise had been spoken into the air, but the scaffold of small injustices that had held the afternoon up had begun to disassemble itself in orderly pieces. The hidden drop-down revealed, the charge path named, the correction slip written, the rubric codes matched to dates, the precedent anchored to a number. That, too, is a kind of work a person learns to do in his life. Set up the tools, sweep the floor, mark the cuts, see the grain.
The supervisor lifted his chin and looked down the length of the counter as if checking that the space could carry a clear sound. Then he set one finger on the binder's paragraph and let it rest there, like a conductor's hand before the first note. I felt a calm settle in my ribs, not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from alignment. My wife would have approved of that word. Alignment. Not louder, straighter. He took a breath that made no show of itself, and the room, including me, breathed with him. The supervisor let his finger rest on the paragraph, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried like a bell struck with felt. He read the policy aloud at the counter, each word leaving the page and standing upright in the room. Educational projects of community interest, documented, processed without fee. It wasn't a performance. It was a simple act of putting sound to ink, but the sound made the ink more real than any stamp could. People in line turned slightly to listen. The guard shifted to clear the sight line. The binder sat open like a modest stage. The brass plaque by the door caught the fluorescent light and flashed once, as if nodding. The clerk's hands hovered over his keyboard, index fingers flexing with the old habit of choosing the fastest path. The supervisor didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the words, then on our papers, then on the terminal. He asked the clerk to enter the override, cite the section, and attach the notes. The clerk obeyed in small, reluctant clicks that softened as the form accepted each field. I stood close enough to see the cursor move like a cautious animal. The red bar that had threatened us dimmed into a thin line and then slid away. A new field opened for justification text, and the supervisor dictated a clean sentence that named the section, named the documents, named the prior case. The clerk typed it and read it back under his breath, as if by saying the words he could get them to sit still. Malik raised his phone one last time. The screen showed the revision date, the small proof that the world had not changed mid-breath. He set the phone on the counter edge as if it were a lantern. I laid my hand on the blue folder and felt, through plastic and paper, the steadiness that comes when your preparation fits the shape of the moment. The supervisor reached for the correction slip he had written and slid it onto the counter where I could see the lines. Visible checkbox on the main intake form. Training on the override path. Policy link on the intake page. He had signed and dated it in that clear block hand. He placed it to the clerk's right, not as a threat, but as an instruction he expected would be followed. Then he nodded to the clerk to finalize. The clerk clicked save and the terminal accepted the record without fees. The system's tone when it acknowledged success was small and soft, but in my body it rang richer than any anthem. The clerk lifted the stamp, and for a half second I braced for the old reflex to return. It didn't. He pressed the stamp onto the felt tray and then onto the approved box with a controlled professional motion. The sound it made was an honest thud, a punctuation mark finally placed where a sentence had been waiting for days. He pushed the receipt toward me. No amount due. He cleared his throat and without looking up said he would flag the training memo and ask intake staff to review the updated path. It wasn't an apology in the way a storybook teaches them, but it was one in the dialect of this house, an admission in the system, a change in the form, a note that pulls thread through cloth instead of cutting. The supervisor added that the intake station would pin the policy link to the bottom of the screen. He said it in the same tone he used for everything else, which to my ears meant it would be done. The woman with the notebook inched forward as if to read the binder's heading with her own eyes. She didn't say anything this time. She didn't need to. Near the door, a man in a cap adjusted it and gave the tiniest nod at the brass plaque. The guard's radio chirped and then fell quiet. Someone in line whispered, "That's right," and the whisper folded into the tick of the wall clock and became part of the building's breath.
The supervisor turned to me and asked if the schedule attached was still accurate. I confirmed the dates. He said the city calendar would show our study session at the public room on those days, that the intake record would carry the code that kept doors open, that the contact for room setup would be included. He said it plainly, like a recipe. He slid a printed confirmation to me and placed a second copy atop the correction slip so they would travel together to wherever forms go when they leave a counter. I looked at Malik. He looked back with the clear face of a boy who had gone to school in the morning and had to know by afternoon the difference between being loud and being true. His shoulders were lower now, as if the straps of a backpack had been loosened by a hand he trusted. He picked up his phone and turned off the flashlight he hadn't realized he'd left on. The clerk, seeing the supervisor's pen near the correction slip again, found a binder of his own under the counter, the intake manual, stiff and underlined in places where practice had corrected print. He opened to a blank page in the back and wrote a line. New intake checkbox for community educational exemption to be added. Staff to review override path. Then he signed his initials next to the notation, a small witness to a small shift. He didn't look at me. That was fine. Humility is not always a face-to-face act. Sometimes it's a line in a book that someone else will read later and be spared our afternoon. The supervisor closed his binder with a soft clap and set it upright. He asked the clerk to post the training note before end of day. The clerk said he would. The guard stepped forward to take the correction slip to the internal board. He slid it carefully between the clear plastic and the cork, smoothing the corners so the paper wouldn't curl. He stood back one pace, checked that it was visible, and returned to his place at the door. That was consequence enough for the day, the practice inscribed where the practice lives. I gathered the papers into my blue folder, the edges warm now from their moment under the light. The folder felt heavier and lighter at the same time, heavier with proof, lighter with the weight that left me when process stopped resisting its own purpose. I closed the folder, and the plastic made a small sigh under my palm. We left the counter not as winners walking away from losers, but as citizens who had asked the city to remember its own rules. The line opened a clean path. The air near the door tasted like outside, even before the door swung. Malik kept pace beside me, and the room for a heartbeat seemed to accompany us. The brass seal, the clock, the fern under the vent, even the dry printer, each kept its place, and by keeping it, made our leaving feel like part of the same civic weather as our entering. On the steps, I paused and let the sunlight find my face. It smelled like hot stone and leaf. Malik stood next to me and leaned without leaning, the way boys do when they don't want to make ceremony out of relief. I looked at his hands and thought of the work they will do.
I thought about how we had carried two histories into a room that prefers one flavor at a time and had set them down without asking either to swallow the other. Inside, words had been read in the open, a path had been corrected, a stamp had learned its place. I felt my wife's quiet approval in the way the breeze lifted the corner of the receipt and then let it fall back into the folder. Not triumph, not absolution, alignment. The kind a carpenter seeks before he ever swings the hammer. It was enough to stand still for a breath and let my ribs loosen, and to know that the boy beside me had felt the lesson in his bones, not just in his ears. We started down the steps with the afternoon in front of us, not empty, but clean. I did not look back through the glass. I didn't need to. The change we carried was written where it counts. Memory is not a prize or a pardon. It is a duty we share. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do in my place. Until the next story.